I grew up in an environment where I felt distant and remote, and there were some alcohol issues going on with our family. And so I spent a lot of time kind of alone and not connecting, and that sort of distance, I think, gave me a real craving for Father, for connection. And once God found me and I realized He'd been pursuing me my whole life and I didn't recognize it, and once I realized that and just felt totally in love with Papa God and realized I was never alone, and I'd go to the store and just kind of feel like I was belonging and that my family was going to the store and so on. And I realized that was something that I could give away. It was something that people needed to know that they were loved, truly loved, apart from performance, apart from anything else. I had been saved earlier, but I think that there is a difference between being saved and then growing into that realization. I was actually in the Army in Europe, and I was in the upstairs living out on the German economy and had no radio, no TV, no books, no nothing. And I spent a lot of time sort of meditating on the Word and then talking to God. And it just suddenly dawned on me I had a best friend. And I thought, wow, this is nice. This is nice. I don't feel alone, even though perhaps I should, but I don't. I don't feel lonely, and it's been with me ever since. I think that each one of us is made for something. Ephesians 4 says that God poured out, the word is metron in the Greek, but He poured out a measure of Himself into each person, and it's who you are. You can't help being that. It's like a north arrow. It's like gravity in your life. It draws you. And I think that's the gravity in my life. It draws me, and eventually you recognize this is what I love to do. And when you purpose to pursue that, then you find your life is a little bit like those in the airport, when you see someone walking on one of those horizontal escalators, they're not actually walking faster, but somehow they're moving faster. And for me, that's how it felt in my life when I began to pursue that. I just felt a wind at my back, and I thought, I love doing this. And I could give you lots of stories of people who said, you should do that. But the reality is I felt inside, this is kind of what I was made for. Let me tell a story of one young man. He actually flew in from the West Coast and wanted to spend some time. And so a friend and I just sat with him and we just talked with him. And he told stories about being dumped from girl after girl after girl and just felt like women were against him. And I looked at my friend and he looked at me and we thought, I don't think that's his problem. And so he said, they just want to be my friend. So we asked him to close his eyes. And you know, when you ask God a direct question, He gives you a direct answer. And so he said, Jesus, let's call this guy Fred, would you help Fred to understand why this is happening in his life? And Fred said the thing that always happens in this kind of ministry. He said, well, I haven't thought of this in a long time, or I've never thought of this, or, well, this funny thought just came into my mind. And he said, I suddenly have a picture of when my little brother was born. And he was born, and I got to go in the room and I ran over there and I was going to grab him. And my mom grabbed him out of my hands and turned her back to me and put him in front of her. And I said, I hate you. Or he said, I didn't scream that out, but inside I said, I'm going to turn my back on you too. And so he realized that for his whole life, he had this distance with his mother. And so we asked him to go back to that time, just in his mind, and to ask Jesus what was true. And so he did, and he said, I just have a sense of Jesus being there with me, and I realize now that my mom thought I would poke the child's eye out, or, because I was 3 years old and I didn't know. And so we said, would you like to forgive your mom? And would you like to break that vow that you made? And would you like to bless your brother? Yeah. So he did all that. And so then we prayed for him, and he said, wow, I just feel this weight has gone off of me. He said, this is crazy. I wouldn't have believed I felt this different just after doing that. And we kind of, you don't really know that you got a toothache that bad until the tooth is pulled and you go, wow, this feels different. I just learned to live with the pain. And so often we learn to live with the pain. And we began to pray for him, and the other guy suddenly got a picture of him being the metron in him was wonderful counselor. And he said, I just feel like you're just a great counselor. And, that may be why girls like to hang out with you. And so he went off just very encouraged. Well, I got an email from him a week later, and he said, "You won't believe what happened." Well, I believe it now. It's kind of like, yeah, I'll believe it, but tell me what happened. And he said, "I've got a girlfriend, and we're mad in love with each other. And my mom and I talk about how to treat a woman, and she's helping me, and this is great." And he said, "I'm very excited." And then he said, "Oh, and guess what? I changed my major to counseling." And it's like, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, I love it." He said, I was an English major and it was great, but he said, "Man, I love it. And thanks a lot." And so 3 months later, I got just a quick email, and it's kind of like the ever-ready bunny. It's still working. And so, that was just a little encounter where we unhooked some things in his life and spoke some truth to him. And it just set the course of his life in a new direction.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone.
How do you sort of partner with God in a ministry setting? So often in this ministry, we feel pretty inept, and our fallback position is checklists or something like that. And really, our fallback position in SOZO ministry is God. And that sounds a little hyper-spiritual or arrogant, but really it's kind of like we say, if God doesn't show up, we can't do SOZO. It just doesn't work very well. We can't fake it very well. We're not very good at it. God uses knuckleheads, and it's a good thing because that's the chief qualification is to be a knucklehead. But listen, I think that most of us innately hear God. God's ability to speak to us surpasses our ability to listen. God can speak in a way that we can hear him. And I think that we, in a sense, as children, hear him better than as adults, because as adults, I think we're learned to interpret and to make things logical and whatever. And I think part of that being childlike in the kingdom is to go back to that place where you say, "God, I believe that somehow I'll know what to do." And God's not human, and his first language is in English, and if we're willing to accept that and to understand that he speaks to us in ways that are better than English, he can communicate a whole paragraph of information in an instant inside of us, and we just know. And everybody is different. Everybody hears and sees and senses differently. I would say on the inside, for me, and for most people I know, each of us has 3 screens on the inside. And so our minds and our wills, we're looking at these screens. And the first screen is our senses and our drives. It's I'm looking at you right now and speaking, so I can see, I can describe this room. If I hear the phone ring, if I'm hungry, I can say, I'm hungry, I should get something to eat. So we're focusing on that screen. Then we have a screen of memory and analysis. I can say, oh, I've got to balance my checkbook today, and I remember how to do math and maybe some painful memories of algebra surface and whatever. Or I can remember a Christmas that I had, and so I can focus on a memory. I can go to a memory, and in a sense, I'm almost there. In fact, science tells us that the visual cortex lights up when we close our eyes and go to a memory because it plays out on that same screen. And the third screen, the third input, would be imagination and intuition. And that is, I could say to you or to the TV watchers, imagine that you're somewhere on top of Mount Everest and that you've got wings and you're going to fly off of Everest and glide across the Tibetan landscape. And you could do that. You could put yourself there, and if you close your eyes and you let yourself go, your heart will beat faster and your visual cortex will light up. And so God can use that screen to bring pictures or bring senses or to bring things that you've never thought of before, but all of a sudden they pop up. And so if we pay attention to the flow of God, he'll light things up on those screens for us. So we say sometimes he puts sauce on it. It suddenly feels, you'll be walking in a woods, you'll see a bird, and all of a sudden that moment has sauce on it. You sense God has said something to you. And if you learn to honor that flow and honor when things have sauce on them, you'll begin to discern and discover the ways of God. And as you pay attention to that, it gets more and more and more specific. One of the concerns is, how do I know it's God? How do I know it's not just me? Or how do I know it's not something darker? If I open myself up to the spiritual world, won't I get deceived? Jesus said, "My sheep know my voice, and the voice of another they will not follow." And so we've really come to see that there are sort of three voices inside of us, just like there are three screens. One is the voice of our own brains, and it's analytical. It takes known data and information, analyzes, assesses it. It's a little drier. It's whatever. Then there's the dark voice, and it's always slimy. It's always accusing. It's always manipulative. It's always, and you just get a sense that is not God, and it's not me. And that's the dark side. Satan can plant thoughts in us. That's what temptation is planted thoughts. He weaves his thoughts into our mind. He tries to disguise himself. So we think it's us. In fact, he'll speak in the first person, very personal, and he'll say, I'm not capable, or I don't love my wife, or I think I'm a pervert, or whatever. And it sounds like our voice, but if you think about it, you go, that is not me. But God's voice always has, and the voice of our spirit, God dwells with our spirit, and God is not so pushy that he forces us to say, oh, that's God and that's my human spirit. He just says, look, out of your belly will flow a river of living water. And Jesus said this in, I think, John 7. And it says, by this he spoke of the Spirit, who his believers were to receive. And he said, out of that place inside of you will flow a river of living water. And that river feels clean. It's got some freshness to it. It sometimes says things that you're a little bit surprised of. Sometimes it sort of comes out of the blue. Sometimes we just say, I got a sudden inspiration or a sudden thought. How do I know? And how do I keep from embarrassing myself or being presumptuous or whatever? And I think I would say a couple things about that. One is that a number of us, maybe most of us, feel like if I'm speaking what I think God says, maybe I should preface it with "Thus saith the Lord," because we don't know for sure. Scripture says we prophesy in part. I know there's some teaching about if you miss it, you should be stoned, and that's an Old Testament construct. The New Testament construct in 1 Corinthians 14 says that when we speak prophetically to someone, or one who prophesies, speaks for edification, consolation, and exhortation. Edification is the word oikodomo, which is, oike is family, domo is house. So I'm building up the family house with what I say. Now that's pretty different than you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger on September 15th, and he's going to hand you a note that's going to say, go to Russia and minister to Jews. That's a whole different thing. So oikodomo, build up the family house. Consolation is paramuthio. Para means to come alongside, and muthio means to speak sweetly. And so it's like spiritual pillow talk in a sense. It's to speak very sweetly and gently to someone, and to speak your heart for them, or maybe God's heart for them. And then the other word is parakaleo. And the Holy Spirit is called the Paraclete, and that's a Greek word. Para, alongside, kaleo means to call. And so when someone is running a marathon and they're running out of gas at the end of that marathon, the Paraclete in the Greek culture was the best friend that they had, who would station himself about the spot in the race when he thought his friend would start running out of gas. And then he would actually join the race at that point and say, you can do it, you can make it, I'm with you. I'm going to get you through to the end. Come on, you can do it. And so the runner would get a sudden surge of adrenaline and love for his friend and serotonin, and he'd finish the race strong. And so that's what we do when we speak. And so I think we have this idea that we're supposed to know all kinds of strange things. Well, sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. But the first thing is that most of what we say is to build up, to encourage, to speak sweetly. God has nice things to say, and he uses people to say them. God has hard questions to ask, and he uses people to ask them. You might say, I had this thought. How does this strike you? Well, you're not saying, thus saith the Lord. If it's God, they'll know it. They'll have a sense. God is watching over his word to perform it. You don't have to frame it as thus saith the Lord and have trumpets and trot it out. You can simply offer it as one friend to another, and it's very low risk. And you know what? If it's God, it's going to strike home. And if it's part God, that part will strike home. And if it's not God, the person will go, No? And you just go on because you know what? It's okay.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
Sometimes when someone comes to us, or we're at Starbucks or some other great coffee house, and we're having a conversation, and you get a sense you're supposed to say something or ask something, and you might do that. But the reality is that happened to Jesus as well. He would say things like to the rich young ruler, and Jesus was spot on with what he said to the rich young ruler, and it says he went away very sad. That doesn't mean that Jesus was wrong. It meant that the word exposed his heart and he made a choice. We all have choices, and for me to not say what I sense doesn't provide that person that choice. And so my job is to simply speak the truth in love. My job isn't to control someone or to make them change their lives. Oftentimes, we'll be in a ministry situation, we'll share something, and we're not sure something happened. There wasn't a breakdown in tears. There wasn't somebody going, oh, I feel so different. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they'll say, you know what you shared, it just kept coming back to me again and again and again. And I want to talk more about that. And so our job is to just scatter the seed. Our job is just to be faithful. And God's job is to watch over the seed. God's job is to cause the growth. Remember, Paul said, Apollos planted, and I planted, I watered, but God caused the growth. And so our part of co-laboring with God is just to be faithful in what he gives us. His job is to watch over it and cause it to grow. The reality is, SOZO is a Greek word, and it means to save, to heal, and to deliver. That same word is used for all of those things. Why didn't God differentiate? He could have picked 3 different words. I think it's because he doesn't want us to separate the two and say, well, I'll take salvation, but I won't take freedom. Or I'll take freedom, but I don't want healing. And so I believe that God said, look, I came to SOZO you. Soteria is the word for grace. SOZO is grace package. And so I came to SOZO you, to save you, to heal you, and to deliver you from the stuff, body, soul, and spirit. And so the SOZO ministry focuses on the soul part, the place in us that's wounded or constrained or entangled. SOZO was given that name in Bethel Church, in Redding, California. A couple of women there were doing inner healing, prayer ministry, deliverance ministry, and they began to call it that because we need something to call that thing that we do when we get together and help someone to be more free. And rather than saying that sentence every time, we just call it SOZO. And so that's really where it came from. It is not controlled by anyone. If you think more like AA than something else, you'd be a lot closer to the structure and the network. It's a network of friends and associates who share with each other, who have the same DNA, the same sense of how ministry should function. We share the same tools that we use. We share back and forth. And there are a number of sort of centers of it. One of the centers is an organization that I and some friends started called the Freedom Resource. You can go to thefreedomresource.org and you can find all about SOZO there. There's lots of downloadable materials, audio, written materials, some PowerPoints are on there. There's a network of churches you can click on there. There's announcements about training and things like that. And we're real excited. It's exploding. It's going all over. It's, quote, lay-based ministry. In other words, we feel like a whole church could operate in this. It's sort of like we want everyone in our church to know how to share their faith. Well, we also want everyone in our church to be trained in spiritual first aid, just like we want everyone in our company to be Red Cross trained for CPR. In the same way, we would like our church, everyone, to have a basic understanding of how to lead someone through forgiveness, how to help them to find confession and release of their sin, how to become disentangled, how to recognize if Satan's trying to control them or manipulate them and get free, and how to recognize if it's more complicated and they should be referred to pastoral counseling staff. And so it's the first line of defense. And so it's used that way very often. Chance conversations, even with non-Christians. We've had some amazing salvation experiences out of this. When people realize that God loves them, salvation's pretty easy. And how do I realize God loves me then if he addresses my felt need for loneliness or my felt need for that or guilt or shame? he addresses that, and I go, wow, I want to get to know this guy more. And so that's a great way for it to spread and to happen.